and welcome to Dialogue. Leaders of NATO member countries and key partners met in Madrid. The all-important summit set NATO's strategic direction for the next decade and beyond, while responding specifically to the Ukraine war. And for the first time, leaders from the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan and South Korea, were also present at the meeting. What's in the new strategic concept of the military organization? And what's its message to Russia? By expanding its focus to China, is NATO creating instability in Asia? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University, Professor Glenn Thiessen from the University of Southeastern Norway, and Victor Gaozhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, and Russian defense analyst Pavel Felgenhauer. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Okay, welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. So I will start with you, Glenn. This year's NATO summit follows closely on from the G7 leaders meeting. What's your takeaway from the meeting of the seven richest countries?
Well, I think they want to reaffirm a lot of what was said at the G7, at the NATO summit. So I think that for this reason, one of the key important objectives is to portray consensus. Because, well, let's be honest, there's a lot of divisions emerging within the NATO bloc. That is, the United States wanting to take a more confrontational stance against Russia, more non-compromising stance, while many of the Europeans, such as the Germans, the French, Italians, are now getting more and more concerned about economic consequences, as well as the disaster of the war in terms of the loss of lives and loss of Ukrainian territory. And so I think there's this divisions popping up now. So, and this, of course, is a challenge to everyone in NATO, because at this point it's important to show some kind of solidarity and unity. So for this reason, they will they're looking for ways of expressing solidarity, which doesn't cut into these dividing divisions. So I think more NATO troops closer to Russian borders, more weapons to Ukraine, expanding the military bloc by, including Sweden and Finland, reaffirming that Russia not just is a challenge anymore, but it's an enemy, and also, extending the scope of adversaries. So listing also China as a challenge. Again, this is also a division. The Americans would like to, go to make NATO also an anti-Chinese China bloc, while the Europeans are more apprehensive about this. So there's a lot of ways they're trying to cover up the divisions and instead portray solidarity. So a good chunk of ideology is also necessary, of course, by portraying this as being presenting this image of a global conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, to present this idea of being, good versus evil. This is it's a good way of framing or propagandizing the international system, because it also shames dissent within the bloc. So if you're opposed to continue this, militarizing the conflict with Russia, then effectively you're undermining democracy. So I think this is the main frame to promote solidarity within NATO.
Mm-hmm. Robert, obviously, the G7 countries, vowed solidarity with Ukraine, for as long as it takes. So the question is, is that just rhetoric, or they are truly committed to it? Given what's happening, of course, in their own countries, we know this energy shortage, inflation, even food crisis looming, probably large for some countries. Do you think they are? Yes, they will give support for as long as it takes?
I think most NATO elites are, which is to say, I think most NATO elites genuinely perceive Vladimir Putin now to be a threat to European security. I think it's pretty clear at this point that he does not accept the post-Cold War settlement. I think the real issue is particularly with European voters and increasingly with American voters, to the extent that the war drags on and it looks like it's generating costs, like you mentioned, sort of higher prices for food and fuel and things like that. You may sort of see some dissent, particularly because of the perception that Ukraine is sort of far away. It's really not our conflict. You see that a lot, particularly in sort of conservative and populist voices in the West. But I think for now, at least, I think there's a fairly strong sense among Western elites that this is sort of the right thing to do, you know, in part because the Russians keep on striking civilian targets in Ukraine, like that mall just today. Every time this kind of stuff happens, it shows up on the news, and I think it sort of closes off the ability of Putin to sort of get out of the war because he just comes off as so brutal, right? And so my sense is that, yeah, is that at least the Ukrainians probably have at least another 6 months or like to the end of the year, solidarity from the West, right? If this thing is still dragging on in winter, if it's actually turned into something like World War I with fairly static lines and just this sort of grinding war of attrition, I think you may see sort of the kind of Kissinger approach where we kind of push the Ukrainians towards an exit. But I don't see that for a while. I don't see that at least until the fall when it becomes colder and European gas prices go back up for fuel.
Mm-hmm. So solidarity for now, at least.
At least for a while, yeah, probably at least until the winter.
Yes. Pavel, obviously, out of G7 meetings, there are more new actual sanctions on Russia. For example, the ban on the gold export, capping of the oil prices. How disruptive or how restrictive that will be in terms of weakening Russia's hands in terms of financing, the operation in Ukraine and also the normal operation of the nation?
It's of course not directly a problem of simply financing. It's more of a problem, how will the Russian industry survive technological blockade from the West? And that's really not clear. For the time being, it's more or less, surviving, of course, because there's still reserves of components and materials. But what will happen in the fall, it's anybody's guess. There's hope that there'll be ways found to bring in the needed imports, essentially needed imports to keep the Russian industry running. But will that happen? Will there begin serious consequences from sanctions really disrupting the industrial base of the Russian state? Right now, there are different opinions. The official opinion, of course, coming from the Kremlin and the government is that everything's going to be fine. Russia will survive. Russia is a great survival nation. Other opinions, say from European institutions, say that there's a very little chance of the Russian industry surviving as it is right now, that there can be very serious consequences. And these consequences could also reflect on the battlefield. That means replacing lost equipment is going to be problematic. Russia doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have things to fight with. It does. It does still have very big stockpiles since the Cold War, but that is not the newest stuff. And that means that there will be more indiscriminate or missing attacks that will hit residential areas, not by intent, but just because someone missed, that there be problems with replacing also, and there's a very serious problem with replacing not only equipment, but also well-trained men, including pilots, specialists. There have been losses there, and you train a good pilot, a really good pilot, an ace. It takes many, many years. And if he's lost, well, that means he's lost. I mean, even if he can replace the plane that's been lost, if he's been killed or injured or captured, it's almost impossible. It takes a lot of time to replace. So it's right now, what happens in the war of attrition is, again, guessable. In theory, Russia fighting a war of attrition against a coalition of over 60 industrial nations is a non-winner. But again, really what happens in the long term, or at least even in the medium term, as this conflict moves from this intensive summer campaign into the fall and then into the winter, what will be the changes inside Russia and inside the bloc of its opponents? Right now is a lot of guesswork, but there could be serious problems up the road.
Well, Glenn, back to you. Obviously, I mean, it's hard to define, whether there's a success for Russia or Ukraine, depending on the long-term or short-term definition. And even for the European countries, because they also suffer from exactly the sanctions they impose on Russia, right?
Yeah. So I guess when this conflict began, there was a lot of assumptions that Russia was weaker than it actually was. So I think that all these goals of first, crushing the Russian economy, crushing its financial system, destroying its currency, it all flopped very quickly as the economy, it's being reorganized, mainly towards the east. The financial system stabilized and the currency has strengthened itself. Obviously, as Pavel pointed out, this could be a temporary solution because a lot of these problems will build up over time. But what wasn't expected, of course, was this huge blowback in terms of the European economy suffering greatly. So we're having, of course, the economic decline, food shortages, energy shortages, and the threat of now going into a depression. And this is also a problem in the long term because for the European industries, they can't really remain competitive anymore because all this cheap Russian energy, cheap Russian metals, all of this now is being reorganized to Asia, and it looks as if Russia's preparing itself for more or less a permanent divorce with the West, so learning to live without the West. And so for the Europeans, this has big implications because not just the challenges from Russia, but in the future now, all this cheap resource will go to Asia, often even now on discount, which means that European economies will no longer be competitive on international markets, and there will be a great suffering. So there are therefore a lot of pressures now on the Europeans to bring this war to an end. But as I mentioned, there are splits within the NATO bloc because for the United States, they actually gain a lot from this war. That is, they're able to impose a lot of bloc discipline. So, and not just this Ukraine becoming this permanent front line to permanently weaken Russia, but it also is a great instrument for achieving what it hasn't been able to achieve in the past. That's getting more economic loyalty from the Europeans. So not only cut off Russian gas in the market, but also getting the Europeans to cut themselves off from China, increasing their dependence on the United States. So I think that as this conflict drags on, the costs are growing for the Europeans. There will become more, these divisions will become clearer as the US has more incentive of keeping this war going, fighting with Ukrainian lives and European finance, while on the other hand, the Europeans find themselves in increasingly weaker position. So I think this economic pain for the West, especially for the Europeans, will only continue to grow. And again, much like Russia will feel its pain more now after the summer towards autumn, I think that the European pain will also set in then as the lack of energy, the food problems, and across the board, all of this will only continue to grow. So again, this is a war of attrition.
Mm-hmm. Well, war is destructive by nature. Victor, out of the G7 statement, people point out one of the highlights is that their talk of China, 14 times China was mentioned in the statement, compared to last year's summit, only 4 times. What do you make of that? They talked about China's, South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, etc. Basically, all of them China's domestic affairs.
Well, first of all, I think this war in Ukraine, or the special military operations in Ukraine, as Russia has called it, has made the United States more dominant, not only within the G7 framework, but also increasingly within NATO and even within EU, because EU is becoming more and more kind of identical to NATO and is picking up more and more as an ideological and defense kind of organization. This is very, very dangerous. Now, from the US perspective of the world, there is only one country which is fast approaching the size of the United States and in many respects has already surpassed that of the United States. So the United States really has an incentive to prevent that from happening. So their top priority is to prevent China surpassing that of the United States. And it wants to rally all the other countries behind it to achieve this goal. But the United States has not proven to be very effective in achieving this goal. And I think for whatever reason, it has seized upon this war in Ukraine, not only to put pressure, maximum pressure on Russia, but also directly or indirectly try to tie Russia and China together. And the ultimate goal is to put more pressure on China. Now, this is a well-calculated game from the United States perspective, but whether major European countries will refuse to wake up to this very harsh reality as partially created by the United States, or whether they will just willingly and voluntarily go along with this grand scheme of the thing and try to turn the megatrend in the world from peace and development to war and confrontation. I think it's not carved in stone. Eventually, I would say, the United States and whatever it has managed to rally behind it will not be able to change the megatrend in the world. That is, we still want peace rather than war, and war will not be one-sided. It will be mutually destructive. Keep in mind, Russia is not a single country. Russia is one of the largest nuclear power arsenal in the world. So if you push Russia further into the corner, then be prepared for Armageddon. And I don't think European countries really want to stare in the eye of the prospect of Armageddon, and they will wake up to the reality now. For the war in Ukraine, I think Russia does not have any incentive to wrap it up quickly. It wants to drag it along at least into 2023, and that really will be the litmus test. I think before major upheavals may happen in Russia, many so-called democracies in Europe or in other places may actually be subject to greater pressure, because you are talking about a very, very dangerous dosage of crisis combined with crisis. Financial crisis, economic crisis, the overhang from the pandemic, refugee crisis, for example, and the food crisis. And then the butchering of the international order. Russia has declared an end to the existing international order. The United States wants to make sure that whatever international order which emerges out from the ashes of the Ukraine war will be different from before February the 24th. But is that really going to happen? I think we all need to sit down and pause and reflect. What is the world of tomorrow? I hope the world of tomorrow will not be possible by excluding Russia. And the world of tomorrow will not be possible to exclude China. How can anyone in the West realistically expect that they can achieve whatever goal they want to impose upon the world by excluding Russia on the one hand and by excluding China on the other hand? Wake up. This is complete delusion.
Well, speak of that, Robert, obviously one major change for NATO summit, to update their strategic concept every 10 years. For this year's summit is really about to expand its focus on China, to China. So what's the rationale behind the move? I mean, is every country on board taking on China? Isn't NATO really about North Atlantic?
Sure, I think this is part of the Biden effort at sort of a community of democracies, right, or sort of authoritarianism versus democracy. This means sort of tying democratic and liberal states into some kind of closer relationship. I don't actually think that it means any kind of serious NATO commitment to Asia. I wouldn't. First of all, the NATO powers just don't have the power projection reach for that. I mean, they can't actually project out here in a meaningful way. So I wouldn't really worry about that. I think instead, a lot of it is sort of rhetorical, and it's a response to the chaos sort of generated within the liberal democratic world by the Trump administration, right? That Donald Trump made it very, very clear he didn't care for U.S. allies. He said all kinds of outlandish stuff on television, right? And I think there was sort of a sense that, look, we need to sort of get back on board, and we need to sort of get the liberal democracies talking to one another, and sort of maybe, some kind of improved trade relationship, greater security and coordination. But I don't think there's anything like a sort of global or intercontinental NATO coming or something like that. The coordination costs for that would be massive, and the European states just don't want to do that with China. I mean, they want to trade with China. So I know I don't see that as a really serious threat or an issue.
Right. Pavel, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said that, for the first time, quote, we will address China and the challenges it poses to our interests, security and values. values. What do you make of this statement?
Well, this NATO summit is basically a watershed summit because it means a basic massive transformation of NATO returning of NATO to its Cold War stance as preparing for all European war, preparing large forces for that. There's going to be an increase in defense spending all over Europe, almost maybe twofold. I mean, this is a massive things that we're talking about, very massive things. And also this means that there's a kind of restatement of the Cold War alliance network that the United States established. It's not that there's going to be kind of a overall global NATO, because there's going to be a NATO and there are going to be other American alliances in the Asia Pacific and other American allies here and there, and all united by the United States, because right now the Europeans have fallen into line because they understand that if they want to address what they perceive as the Russian threat, they need the United States. Without the United States, there's no NATO. Without the United States, there's no kind of alliances in the Asia Pacific. So the United States is the key. And continuing confrontation in Ukraine makes the United States stronger and its position stronger, and that makes Russia weaker. And that's, again, good for the United States. I agree with that fully. And I believe they're going to continue that. And the Europeans, who were very skeptical for quite a number of years of actually they didn't want to, despite all the American prodding, to increase defense spending, to see China as an enemy. Now they're just following up because, well, without following the United States, they believe that they are in grave risk. And that's the trend that's going to be there for the time being if the present situation continues as it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, Glenn, Stoltenberg also once said, we will also address the security consequences of China. We will not refer to China as an adversary, but we will take into account that this matters also for our security. For European countries, for example, how does China pose any challenge to the security, like France, like, maybe other European countries in the European continent, Germany, for example? I mean, it's far away from each other, and there's no geopolitical competition between China and European countries.
Oh, and that's a good point. I mean, there was only now that, for example, the Dutch government went out and said they were greatly concerned about China's increasing influence in Asia. I mean, this is on the other side of the planet, and still this is a concern for the Dutch. But still, on the other hand, we refuse to recognize that the world's largest military bloc rolling into Ukraine should have that Russia has any legitimate security concern of this. So obviously, there's a lot of hypocrisy. But this NATO statement is obviously a compromise. And as was mentioned before, this has certain opportunities for the United States, because the problem with this economic rise of China is that the whole world is becoming more economic dependent on China. So how can the US lead an alliance in Europe and in Asia, effectively having countries act against their own economic interest and prosperity by cooperating with China? Well, there's only one way, that is to militarize a lot of this economic rivalry. And that's to a large extent what we've seen. And this has been the challenge of the United States, which we've seen over the past years. How do you convert the security dependence on the United States into economic loyalty? So buying, for example, American technologies, not the Chinese. And this is why there's an incentive to militarize these conflicts. And that's also why you see the American rhetoric trying now to suggest that China's helping Russia, hence NATOs have to go after China. We have to build alliances against China. And I think this is the direction we're moving in. But again, this is very problematic for Europe. For the Europeans, they've been talking for many years now about the European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. This means not just being too dependent on America, but also having ties with the rest of the world. However, making China an enemy of Europe would effectively cancel all of European sovereignty and strategic autonomy, make it excessively reliant on the United States. So there's an interest in Europe not to push this too far. On the other hand, Europe at the moment is very much dependent on the United States because of this conflict in Ukraine. So I think that this was a compromise. Again, heeding to some of America's desires to extend NATO into effectively global NATO, having this ideological mission, if you will, of the West representing democracy, fighting against authoritarianism. But this whole package, they accepted it to some extent. Nonetheless, simply recognizing that China is a challenge, but avoiding this labeling as a threat. So again, having the opportunity to roll this back later on.
Mm-hmm. Well, other European countries may be seeking a compromise on that, Victor. If you look at the UK, for example, UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss obviously is a different category. She tweeted, I quote, "At the NATO summit in Madrid this week, we must not only ensure NATO remains the cornerstone of Europe's defense, but also has the resources to adopt a more global rule tackling the threats we face, including from an increasingly assertive China." Sitting in Beijing, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, Liz Truss doesn't seem to be the foreign secretary of the UK government. She more resembles a deputy secretary of state of the State Department of the United States. And she really is very much confused by the world view. I think China is a force for peace and cooperation. And China is a factor that no one can disregard, that's for sure. China is already significantly larger than the United States in many important measurements. But China has no desire at all to replace the United States as the next superpower in the world. We have no desire at all to impose our very unique political system or values onto any other country. So this is the reality. But if she chooses to completely disregard that, not only to her own detriment, but also to the British detriment, and then she wants to bring the detriment to the rest of the Western world, then what can you do? You will see this very, very subjugated role for Britain following in the close footsteps of the United States. But I think European countries in general will sooner or later wake up to the reality that China is indeed an increasingly important factor, but it's not a factor to be confronted. It's a factor to be engaged for mutual respect and for mutual benefit.
Yes, and also another important development for the NATO summit, Robert, is really about the participation of some Asian countries, including South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, in particular South Korea. So what is the intention, what is the rationale for South Korea's enthusiasm to join this meeting?
Sure. I think as we talked about before, I think the Biden administration has sort of emphasized the idea of sort of a community of democracies or authoritarianism versus democracy. And NATO summits bring together a lot of the world's most powerful democracies anyway, so it's not too difficult to invite in others. And I think that's what this is more generally. I think for the South Koreans, specifically, this sort of comes back to domestic politics, which is to say that the previous South Korean president was sort of on the left, and the South Korean left is somewhat anti-American, and he kind of kept his distance from the United States in order to pursue a détente with North Korea. His name was Moon Jae-in. That didn't really work out terribly well, right? And when the current president was running as a candidate, he really emphasized the idea of sort of restoring a relationship that Moon had damaged. And that's actually a really deeply divisive question here in South Korea. But this is something that Yoon had really emphasized a great deal. And that's one of the things I think that this is showing, right? And if I follow Yoon's Twitter feed, he's been talking about this kind of stuff a lot. And so I think that's really what the NATO trip is doing. It's sort of sealing a rift that had kind of opened for a few years there.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.